to the book launch for Katharina Loew's fabulous new book, Special Effects and German Silent Film, Techno-Romantic Cinema, from Amsterdam University Press. I am Sarah Keller. I'm here to introduce everyone and the event for today. I'll be moderating. I am Associate Professor of Cinema Studies and Art at University of Massachusetts, Boston, alongside my outstanding colleague who we're here to celebrate today. So let me first introduce Katharina Loew, who is assistant. Oh, wait, no, she's not assistant professor. We just learned today that she is associate professor of German and cinema studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. So let's also celebrate tenure for my outstanding colleague. Katharina Loew is the author of several articles and chapters on early cinema and cinema technology, effects, culture, and aesthetics, including in Film Criticism and New German Critique, as well as a number of edited collections. Her most recent work, of course, is the book that we're here to celebrate and discuss today, Special Effects in German Silent Film, Techno-Romantic Cinema, hot off the press from Amsterdam University Press. Katharina's work is exciting for a number of reasons, most of all because she writes with equally enviable lucidity about complicated technical processes and the much larger complexities of cinema culture and history. She possesses a facility with the full range of that history and makes often revelatory connections among its related fields and all the areas of her wide-ranging interests. Today, she's going to open the launch by introducing and talking a little bit about the book, and then she'll join her interlocutor, Ariel Rogers, for a short discussion. So let me also introduce Ariel Rogers. For those who don't already know all of this very well, she is associate professor at Northwestern University and the author of two fabulous books on cinema experience and the history of screens, both from Columbia University Press, Cinematic Appeals, the Experience of New Movie Technologies, which came out in 2013, and On the Screen, Displaying the Moving Image, 1926 to 1942, which came out in 2019. After they have their discussion, we'll open things up for questions from all of you. In the meantime, please know that attending today's launch entitles you to 50% off Katharina's book. Please see the chat for info, which Lucia is going to provide. And let me now pass it off to Katharina Loew.
Thank you so much for this incredibly kind and generous introduction, Sarah, and for moderating today, and to Ariel for serving as my wonderful collaborator in this enterprise. So I'm very excited about this, and to all of you for coming today, which is a great honor. So I'm going to start off by running you quickly through the chapters of my book so that you have a sense what's in the book. And so let me get started. Here's the table of contents and the introduction, which is called Special Effects and the Techno-Romantic Paradigm. So I start off by asking, so what do I mean by techno-romantic? Techno-romantic, I identify as one of the key characteristics of German silent cinema, namely a paradoxical attitude towards machine technology. And the techno-romantic describes a tendency to construe technology as a means to get at something that is beyond the material and instead something intangible or spiritual. So next, sorry. Oh, hang on. Where are we? I got lost. Yes, okay, sorry. Yeah, that's where I wanted to go. So, okay. In the context of arts, industrialization and specifically machine technology represented a huge problem. All art needs to evoke concepts, sensations, and the imaginary to elicit effective responses. In order to count as an art or to gather some kind of respect in the art world, cinema had to demonstrate that even though it was understood as the medium of the machine age, it could meet the stipulations of idealist aesthetics and do so in ways that were recognized as medium specific. Medium specific expressivity was then identified in the realm of special effects. And this focus on special effects emphasizes a perspective that understands special effects more in terms of an artistic device than something that we just put in for decoration, like a spectacle, or for practical purposes. So this perspective takes special effects seriously in artistic ways. So the first chapter deals with early German film theory. In the attempt to establish cinema as an art, early film critics identified two areas that were thought of as uniquely cinematic. Those were, on the one hand, images of nature, which were perceived as poetic, but not really beyond material reality. So just automatic reproductions of material reality, and therefore that was quite problematic. And on the other hand, trick effects, which were also identified as uniquely cinematic, something that cinema had in advance of all other arts and media, but was also creative. And so this is already points towards the artistic potential of special effects. Early critics like Hans-Heinz Evers, Georg Lukács, and Herbert Tannenbaum, who play a large role in this chapter, argued for cinema's ontological affinity with folk art, with mental processes, and also with the fantastic, and saw special effects as one of cinema's the key pathway towards a spiritual dimension. The next chapter, the second chapter, deals with two outstanding film technicians, Guido Seeber and Eugen Schüchtern, who both
Katharina, you're muted.
I know, I wasn't notified that the host muted me, so I hope now it works again. So the second chapter deals with two outstanding film technicians who were really instrumental in shaping the German film scene of the 1920s, Guido Seeber and Eugen Schüchtern. Guido Seeber was an outstanding cameraman, a cameraman of the first hour. He started as a photographer in the 1890s. And then became sort of he was often called the Altmeister, the doyen of German film technology and cinematography. He made dents in a number of ways. In particular, he was interested in film tricks and special effects, which is evident from The Student of Prague, which I will discuss a little bit later, and Geheimnisse einer Seele, for example, which features a plethora of really innovative special effects. On the other hand, he also expanded the camera's ability with moving camera shots, for example, in Sylvester, that were quite recognized in the German discussion, or in Freudlose Gasse, where he used dollies, etc. Arguably, his most important contribution, however, was maybe as a publicist. He was the co-founder of two film technological journals, Die Kinotechnik, which started coming out in 1919, and Filmtechnik in 1925. And he published two groundbreaking books, Der praktische Kameramann, The Practical Cameraman in 1927, and The Trick Film and Its Basic Possibilities, which is the first book-length study on special effects. Yes. Okay, the second person I'm looking at in this second chapter is Eugen Schüchtern. Eugen Schüchtern was also, or became after his career as a trick specialist, became a cinematographer. His first film as a cinematographer was Menschen am Sonntag, which is recognized as an outstanding achievement from a young group of filmmakers, including Robert Siodmak, Billy Wilder, Kurt Siodmak, Zinnemann, and so forth. He then went into exile in France and made a number of very important films of poetic realist films, and then he even in his later in life, the 1960s, he made films like Les Yeux Sans Visage and The Hustler, for which he received an Oscar. He had a terrible hard time to work in the United States, but he still managed to make The Hustler in New York and received an Oscar for that. He is best known, of course, for his trick technological invention, which is a composite process that makes use of a mirror, a semi-transparent mirror that combines either models or transparencies with live action footage. And here you can see some of the how the workings of this. So there's a Schüchtern mirror with a hole in it, and the hole of, allows the compositing of a live action component here, and the lens allows for the utilization of transparencies. Yes. And here we have an example from Siegfried, Die Nibelungen, which shows how the dwarves are petrified. And there are two sliding Schüchtern mirrors used here, which allows for a very convincing representation of this petrification process. That is not just a superimposition, but really like a process of petrifying the dwarves from the feet on down. Okay, the third chapter, I'm looking at The Student of Prague, which was one of the projects of Guido Seeber's Heart. He made this film in a collaboration with a number of cinephiles, early cinephiles, specifically Hans-Heinz Evers, the author Hans-Heinz Evers that I already mentioned, actor Paul Wegener, director Stellan Rie and Seber already. And their professed object was to demonstrate the feasibility of film art. So they attempted to combine the medium's unique areas of strength, namely location photography and trick effects, in order to capture something in the immaterial realm. Trick effects facilitate the cinematic treatment of the doppelganger motif, which allows for a range of interpretations. In particular, philosophical and psychological reflection about identity and about self, and shows that film was capable of capturing like complex ideas on film. And so what is more, the confrontation of the doppelganger and the location shots allow for a particularly effective viewer response, and the film is often regarded as the first horror film because the audience felt really horrified seeing this doppelganger in a realistic setting. The fourth chapter looks at Nosferatu and occultism. Occultism, the connection between film and occultism are still underexplored, in contrast with literature and art history, where this role has been much more examined in the scholarship. The occultists are interested in secret realities beyond our perceptual capacities. Through these interests, occultism at the turn of the century offered an alternative to modern rationalism, mechanization, secularization, all these things that made modern existence very unpleasant, and promised a metaphysical reframing of the world from a holistic and non-normative perspective. The creators of Nosferatu all had occultist interest, led by Albin Grau, who was the set designer and also the producer. He co-owned the aptly named Studio Prana film, even though the film doesn't contain too many obviously occultist hints or symbols, just a few interspersed in the film, like here, this occultist amulet, and then the famous letter from Orlok, between Orlok and Knock, and then some posters with astrological symbol in Hebrew and in Arabic on the walls of Professor Bulwer, who is described as a Paracelsian, which obviously is in the occultist spectrum. So the film can be read productively as an articulation of occultist ideas in a medium specific that is in a technological way. And also the goal of film art obviously was also in the center here. The goal was to make invisible forces and realities perceptible. And obviously special effects played a huge role in this undertaking. In particular, special effects served to externalize the vampire's nature, which was conceived according to occultist ideas. But special effects were not the only way in which Nosferatu was concerned with hidden forces. Of course, there are also a number of analogies and spiritual phenomena, the powers of the shadow, etc., that all feed into this interest in the invisible and the hidden. The next chapter is concerned with Metropolis. Here, I was particularly struck by the apparent conflict or paradox between that technology serves as an agent of tyranny and dehumanization, at the same time as the film was advertised as a technological marvel itself, as you see in some of the things from the press at the time that explain in detail how the special effects were achieved, like the shift-on shot on the left, and then the rear projection in the middle, and the stop motion animation on the right. And then, of course, technology is also shown as a spectacle that is both malicious and it's both malicious and marvelous. Special effects facilitate encounters with overpowering technological objects and environments, which I frame in terms of a technological sublime. The sublime describes experiences beyond the earthly and the finite, and in Metropolis, special effects serve to capture the unfathomability of technology itself. So we have almost like a feedback loop here. Technology is representing technology and what it entails. I'm gonna let you watch this wonderful sequence to the end. And it's like, it's important to bear in mind, it's like this really evil act. The guy is stealing the livelihood of this young woman. And at the same time, it's such a wonderful and overwhelmingly beautiful and stunning a celebration of the power of technology that is going on at the same time. So we have like really attention that is very much at the heart of what the book is about. Okay, so now the sixth chapter, German technique in Hollywood, which looks specifically at moving camera feeds and extreme camera angles as medium-specific expressive devices. And we can also, as I argue in this chapter, understand them as a type of special effect. They were certainly understood that way at the time when people talked about, Sieber, for example, mentions camera feeds and extreme camera angles as in his special effects books. They were called trick angles and in the trade press at the time. So we have two things that I emphasize here. One is the German interest in moving camera feeds, which is often known as the unchained camera. And then on the other hand, trick angles, which start around the early 1920s, but were not really seen in Hollywood until Varieté, which really caused a large response in Hollywood. German directors were invited to Hollywood to demonstrate the German tricks and understanding of so the usual understanding of how a German filmmaking influenced Hollywood is related to technology specifically, which is not entirely true insofar as like there are no special effects that really wandered from Germany to Hollywood. However, what is absolutely true is that there's like this interest in using cinematic devices like moving camera feeds and extreme camera angles as devices to represent ideas and feelings and immerse viewers emotionally, and Hollywood clearly picked up on this in German cinema. And finally, in the conclusion, I look at the sort of consistencies between the techno-romantic in the 1920s and what we can think of techno-romantic tendencies today. We have a similar a feeling of being overwhelmed, experiencing alienation, as we all very well know, coming out of a very technological pandemic just now. And at the same time, technology is celebrated in so many ways. So we have like this contradiction to the present day. And I also, what I hope to show is that that special effects should not only be viewed in this binary between spectacles on the one hand, fantastic spectacles, and practical effects that should not be noticed, basically. But there are also a number of special effects, even in filmmaking throughout history, that are expressive, that call attention to themselves and work very much in ways that is relatable, or that relates to the early German film technological scene. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Katharina. Fantastic. So for those of you who joined late, we're now turning to a conversation between Katharina and Ariel Rogers.
I just first want to say thank you, Katharina, for including me in this discussion. It's a real honor to talk about your wonderful book with you. And I also want to echo what Sarah said earlier about how beautifully the book brings together a lucid conceptual framing with a meticulous history and brilliant film analysis to make a really important contribution, both to work on special effects and technology and to work on German cinema. And it was wonderful to see that overview just now. So as you note in the book, and as you kind of just alluded to just now, scholarship on special effects, often looking at Hollywood cinema, has tended to focus on either astonishing spectacles or inconspicuous uses for practical purposes. And one of the things your book shows is how paying attention to the role special effects played in German cinema of the 1910s and 20s reveals how they have also been conceived and applied as artistic devices. And you introduced the techno-romantic as the paradigm through which that took place. And I was just wondering if you could start by talking a little bit about how you came to these ideas as a way of understanding special effects in German silent film.
Thank you so much for this wonderful question. Yes, I originally was struck by the fact that there, as many people are struck by the fact that there's such a density of fantastic films in early German films. And there's such interest in the fantastic. So I started thinking about why is that, and how can we make sense of this? But when you look at the how the industry professionals talk about these things, it becomes very clear that what they're really interested is not like the fantastic per se, but really that it's a way of getting at something else, namely at something that is sort of transcending cinema's realistic limitations and using cinema creatively. And so I really wondered, like, on the one hand, they seem very apprehensive about modernity in a certain way. They are anxious about rationalization and that the human component is getting lost, that humanity is basically eradicated by technology. But on the other hand, they enthusiastically embrace technology and really want to make use of it in creative ways. And so this is where the idea of the techno-romantic really got born in this conflict that they really bridge. And the techno-romantic also allows me to think about this era apart from what has traditionally be a little bit like ideological dichotomies between, left wing or right wing, proto-Nazi on, a very sort of schematic thinking and kind of construct a cultural environment that is very complex, but that kind of embraces a number of tendencies under one common hat, if you want. Yeah.
Wonderful. So building on that, I wanted to talk maybe a little bit more about the way that your project intervenes in work on German cinema, which has tended to focus primarily on the cinema's relationship to social and political dynamics, especially the rise of National Socialism, as you mentioned. And in centering your book around technology and special effects, you don't ignore the cinema's historical context, as you just made clear, but rather offer new lenses through which to view it, including by introducing the techno-romantic paradigm as a cultural framework shared by practitioners with different political views. And I was just wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about how paying attention to the techno-romantic paradigm allows us to understand Weimar cinema's relationship to its social and political context differently.
Yeah. Thank you. It's really interesting because Weimar cinema is like one of these cinemas where everybody thinks we know it really well. There are a lot of canonical films. People have very preconceived, and me included, of course, preconceived things, how things were, how things worked. There are a lot of labels floating around, starting from expressionism, which I have managed to almost completely avoid in the book, to a plethora of other labels that were, including the Unchained Camera, by the way, which is also a problematic label. The people at the time liked the labels, the commentators, and these labels have often unquestioned or largely unquestioned been just taken over into the film scholarship. So I think what I've tried to do is to really think what did people mean by using certain labels, and what was the situation on the ground, and sort of build up from there, rather, and like really think through labeling. And I think that that opens up very interesting new perspectives on the era, even though the book is really concerned with canonical works in the end of the day. But it's what I aim to do is like complicate our knowledge about these works, and I dig a little bit deeper still, and there's still a lot to be found, I have to say, regardless of how well we think we know these films. We really don't. So yes, I have made a small contribution to getting to know them in a new way.
Could you talk a little bit more about how your perspective complicates the films in a way that diverges from conventional discussions of expressionism, or if you want also how what you're doing also diverges from conventional accounts of romanticism, which is obviously kind of evoked, but evoked by your concept of the techno-romantic, but you're distinguishing yourself from that also.
So, I mean, the term romantic was really very popular at the time. It was used sort of as the anti-modern, or what people sort of wanted to preserve against the modern. So like, of course, it has its root in the actual romantic era, in the actual late 18th and early 19th century. But it's more the romantic that they talk about in the beginning of the 20th century is obviously a very different romantic than a century before. But it's like the counter term towards modern, or like it has to do with emotion, it has to do with spirituality, it has to do with also looking back. There's a certain nostalgia to it, you know, the good old ways. Even if it's not reactionary necessarily, it can take multiple different shades. So that's that. The techno-romantic exactly is trying to sort of like using technology, which is the modern, as a tool to get at this romantic, at this I don't want to call it anti-modern, because it really isn't. It is ultimately completely modern, because it tries to negotiate between the a modern life that is that people fear in a certain way, but also make it livable. How can we live in a modern life and still be human beings? Basically, this is what they were asking themselves, I guess. And of course, it has to do with interiority and emotion and things that are often very broadly associated with expressionism. But I think this understanding of expressionism is just way too big for my comfort, because there were a lot of movements at the time that were concerned with emotions and interiority. If we just think at symbolism, for example, or and a number of avant-gardes, of course, as well. Why expressionism? It feels like the term has been overused so much that it lost most of its meaning. And at the time, it very few of the filmmakers active in Weimar Germany would have accepted this term for themselves. It was sort of like at the very beginning of the 1920s, was sort of like a pop culture thing that, you know, that was hip at the time, expressionism, but not necessarily seriously. So I think we also have tended to take things that were sort of pop culturally interesting, including occultism, in fact, too seriously, and have ascribed sort of the ideology alongside with sort of the forms. So yes, it just doesn't come to an end, but I'm going to end anyways.
So maybe I'll ask one more question before we open it up, if that's okay. So one of the things that I think is particularly exciting about the book is how it situates canonical films like Nosferatu and Metropolis in relationship to an incredibly deep archive of less well-known films and elucidates them through such careful and new archival research as, like, I think you're just already showing some of the kind of benefits of that. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your archival work, for instance, discoveries that were particularly exciting or that helped you to see things differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like one of the things that I found interesting and exciting was sort of like understanding the Schüchtern companies business enterprise a little bit better, because I think you know Schüchtern patented the hell out of this invention. He took out 40 patents for basically, I mean, not the same process obviously, but like very related processes in worldwide basically. So I mean, I know more than 40 because I found 40, so I have no idea how many more there are. But this is kind of this showed me how like sort of a commercial industry was developing in the film technological world, precisely. And I think also what I started to understand, which many people already understood, I didn't, how sort of the commercial film industry was functioning in the Weimar era, and our understanding, sort of a superficial understanding of the German cinema of the 1920s as an avant-garde is just completely wrong. That they took forms, obviously, that were, again, pop culturally relevant at the time, and they were very much concerned with doing art or making art, but they were not. They were a commercial film industry that sort of tried to negotiate between art and commercial interests, and sort of even make art a tool in a commercial context. Like Erich Pommer said, that a purely commercial film will never be artistic, but an artistic film can certainly be commercially viable. So, and this is what they were trying to do, make artistic films that were commercially viable and sort of conquer the world with that concept. Understanding this kind of, also that feels maybe from an American Hollywood perspective a little bit weird, but it totally makes sense in the context of 1920s Germany.
Thank you so much, Ariel, for those incisive questions, and Katharina for your fantastic answers. We now want to open things up for other people to ask questions. If you have managed to get through this whole year without using Zoom very much, if you toggle over the screen at the bottom, it says reactions, and you can use the raise hand function, or you can put your question in the chat and I'll read it for you if you prefer that. Matthew, I saw your hand up first. And you'll need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Katharina, congratulations on the book. I look forward to reading it. Just on your account of the much abused term expressionism, I anticipate assigning this to my students as well. So looks like ProQuest has your book, so I'll be reading it in that fashion right away. One of the other giant cliches, much abused, is the so-called German influence on Hollywood through Murnau and others. So there's probably a grain of truth to that narrative, but given your research, given your modifications to these terribly persistent kind of master narratives, how would you modify our account of the German influence on Hollywood? Certainly we'd want to expand beyond the great directors to include technical personnel. Would you offer other major modifications to that story,
Okay.
German influence on Hollywood?
Thank you. That's a great question. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah, so I went into this like looking at Hollywood exactly from the perspective of like, the cliche is technological. Somehow German technology made its way to Hollywood and influenced Hollywood in some ways. What I found is that there were very little, in fact, invited people coming into Hollywood. That were not directors. So okay, let me rephrase that. They Hollywood studios hired directors and actors in order to do two things. One, produce films that were sort of international pictures in a similar way that the Germans were doing. They were trying to do international pictures that could be sold on the international market. Anywhere, and show their tricks basically to in Hollywood. So those were of course Murnau and Leni and initially Dupont and a whole range. Like they hired so many directors only in 1926, like I don't remember, like over 10 directors from Germany in 1926 alone. In order, like every studio had at least one or two German directors on staff. And I was really curious why directors, why not cinematographers, if they were interested in the technological or the techniques, right? And there were like even Karl Freund, who was well established in the United States as a name, of course, because of his involvement in Der letzte Mann and in Variety. Seemingly did not immediately find a job when he came to the US. So it took him like 3/4 of a year to find a permanent job, which is like quite stunning, in fact. So it seems like there was very little interest in Hollywood to hire foreign technical personnel, as far as I can tell. I think the sense was we can do this our own. We just need to have someone to tell us what to do. And this is where the director comes in. So the director, we at best technologically, that's sort of the sense in Hollywood, but we need someone to tell us the tricks, what we should do. And I think, again, the sense was for the Hollywood people that that we can do anything technologically. So we don't have to look for things. So I don't think there's a direct line technologically as it has been framed in the past, but rather this idea is that we use technology for invisible representations. How do you make someone like convey what somebody's feeling with a camera, for example? These kind of things, I think, were and not by everybody, of course, in Hollywood, but people commented on them, were very interested in how can you psychologize with film technology. And I think this was sort of the main contribution of those German directors in Hollywood, at least in the 1920s, yes. Thank you.
Thank you for that great question, Matthew. Vetri, you had your hand up before. Have you changed your mind?
Oh, I can go. Thank you, Katharina, and thank you, Ariel and Sarah. This is great because working in Italian studies too, it's just so nice to see that false dichotomy between Hollywood being the center of technological innovation versus Europe being the center of avant-garde or realism in the case of Italian cinema. It's great that it just complicates this so much. It's wonderful. I guess I had a two-part question. Like, what was the toughest part for you in this book project? Maybe if you can think of one challenge. Curious to know your process of writing and what were maybe the biggest challenges you had to face. Thank you.
That's a great question. I think like formulating sort of the idea of the techno-romantic was probably the most challenging one, because I think I had early on a sense in this regard, but it took me a long time working through this and thinking through this to make it into sort of a coherent and sort of a thing that I could hold on to. So that I think was difficult. Apart from that there were so many other avenues I could have gone And this could have just gone on forever. And this was also very difficult to sort of rein it in and say, stop now, to myself. So I think those maybe were my biggest challenges.
Thanks for that, Petri. And thanks for that good answer and that honest answer, Katharina. I see Isadora has a hand up. Would you like to go?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for the presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book. One thing that I wanted to know, of course, as someone who hasn't read the book, but just from your presentation so far, is could you talk a little bit about the choice of films to focus on? Because particularly when we talk about those narratives that are constructed and like the incredibly overblown use of expressionism, so much of that narrative is focused on very specific films. And of course, like Metropolis, Nosferatu to a lesser extent, but still quite big, something like The Student from Prague. So how to navigate that, and at the same time, I often find it difficult then when writing about Weimar cinema to, on the one hand, not just fall into this trap of just talking about these films that have been written about a lot, but on the other hand, also not to kind of artificially avoid them in a way and then end up focusing on perhaps lesser films just so you don't go there. So how did you navigate that? And Ariel mentioned, for example, the fact that maybe in the chapters that the names have these more famous films, but then in the examples you often do comparisons with that. So I would be curious to hear from that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think that was another challenge actually. I mean, you know, there was some films like Metropolis. It was totally obvious to me that I cannot write a book on special effects in German silent cinema that has not Metropolis featuring prominently. And even though I did not particularly care to write about Metropolis initially, because it has been written about so many times, etc. It actually was very, so I tried to look into this, and like then it became such a rich area of sort of a playing ground, because the film has been written about so much, in part because there's so much there, and so it feels like almost one can always find another angle that is fairly easily actually that is extremely exciting in a certain way, and I of course also try to have sort of a sample of films that are like not only in the 20s. I wanted to include something from beforehand, and so like I tried to kind of there were a lot of consideration that not one could have also made different choices. Of course, one could have done only in the 20s, but then it would have been very tight. I could have also used more Fritz Lang films, but of course I didn't want to do more Fritz Lang films because it was not supposed to be a book on Fritz Lang only, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of considerations in that regard. I was very intrigued by this occultist angle, and sort of using it as a pathway to think about a cultural sphere that has not been talked about so much. What else? Yeah, so and of course a consideration is also like if you write about very unknown films, people might be intrigued who are already immersed in the era, but I think because my overall goal was to sort of break the cliches a little bit, I felt like I needed to look at films that people know. Otherwise, it's just, oh yeah, but these are the exceptions, these unknown films, you know what I mean? So those are some of the considerations that I had in mind. Thank you so much for this question.
Wonderful. Robert.
Oh, hi, thanks. So I'm just curious and interested to hear a little more about how you think about camera movement in relation to your wider subject. Because, well, my understanding is that camera movement is not typically included in the kind of considered as a special effect. And yet it, of course, is a very special effect of cinema. You sort of mentioned a second ago about how it allows us to think about the psychology of the characters. And I know that camera movement often has a connection to point of view. But I also think about spectacle, certainly in relation to special effects and maybe specifically with camera movement as well. So I'm just curious about how it fits into the big picture for you.
That's a great question. Of course, I did not want to use all camera movements as a special effect. This is just wrong. But I think, particularly in the mid-20s, there's a lot of like, you know, cameras on swings, like revolving cameras, like sort of drop downs, camera being hauled up, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think these kind of effects, at least in the 1920s, and now actually beyond that also, can be understood as a special effects because they are like special. They require special sort of arrangement to make them happen. And Guido Seeber, for example, talks about how like, you know, how you have to do certain things in order to make this happen. And they create an effect in the audience, of course, a special effect also. So I think these kind of things can be thought of as a kind of a special effect, whereas you know, a tracking shot or, you know, like a pan or something like that might have been a special effect like 20 years earlier. You know, this is similar. And when it was new, like I know Guido Seeber made a film like around 1900, which has a gigantic long pan, right? So, and the film is just this pan. This one, I think we can also think of as a special effect in a certain way, you know. But of course, as soon as either this gets normalized and then also not used so excessively anymore, then maybe we don't want to talk about it anymore as in terms of special effect. I think in the 1920s, we can talk about these crazy camera movements as special effects, but maybe not 20 years later.
That was a great question. I think we have time for about one more question, possibly two if they're short. Katie, great.
Hi, thank you for the talk, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book, especially the chapter on Guido Seeber, because I read some of his translations in the Promise of Cinema anthology. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about some of the film technical journals that you read and some of the things that you found in there, like some of the debates that some of the technicians were having or any kind of surprises in your research.
I mean, those journals are really, really valuable in many ways. Of course, we find out how things work. I really liked reading Kinotechnik and Filmtechnik. I highly recommend it to anyone who has not looked at these. But they also have aesthetic conversations, and we really, you know, change things, how we think of things. Like, for example, there's an article in the very first issue of Kinotechnik by Guido Seeber about rear projection, which we did not. I mean, it's very much changing sort of our understanding of rear projection, becoming like a thing in the very late 1920s or 1930s. Not that he's saying we use it all the time and it totally changes our understanding entirely, but just that it existed and people were working with this, like, it surprised me very much and was very delightful to understand a little bit more of what was happening, or what people were thinking about and what they were interested in terms of developing technologies, even if they didn't work so well. So those are really a treasure trove of also film criticism, technical film criticism. You find there, then of course, you know, machine reviews and a close observation, of course, of what was happening in the US, because this is also very interesting of how the technicians were observing what was happening elsewhere. Patent reviews and so on and so forth. So it's really, for anyone interested in technology, this is really a wonderful resource. So highly recommend it.
Thank you for that question as well. We're just about out of time, so let me take the final moment or so just to thank everyone for coming today, for all of your fabulous questions and your attention and interest in the book. I want to thank Lucia Dove for organizing this book launch for Amsterdam University Press, and especially Ariel Rogers for being an amazing interlocutor for Katharina's ideas in the book and for her. And then, of course, Katharina Loew, who we are celebrating today. Please make sure that you buy the book, or that you encourage your institutional libraries to get a copy of the book. And make sure that you read it and enjoy every last delicious word of it. Thank you all so much for coming, and take good care.